By the way, am I, do you guys feel the same way? Am I the only person? Because I feel like this is the common sense take to have. Whereas if you're new, you're not going to have that same type of insight. I mean, that's common sense, man. It's such a, this is the thing. It's so common sense. Of course they're going to think that. Obviously, they're going to think that. It's common sense. And so I appreciate, you know, at least standing on common fucking sense. So on both sides, you don't know? Well, yeah, of course, everybody knows that. It's common sense. This is a huge victory for, what do you call it? A huge victory for common sense. Massive victory for common sense. But to be honest, this is a common sense reality that any reasonable, intelligent person would have come to. On his behalf, they're getting in battles on behalf of common sense. I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have genocide that's baked into their laws are getting genocided. Yeah, I mean, it's common sense when you think about it. I don't give a fuck. They're terrible people. It's not even a question. It's common sense, exactly. It's just common sense. They'd be doing the same thing. This is common sense. They're not able to kill as many people as Israel because they don't have as many bombs and as many weapons. But if they did, they'd be doing the same thing. You would need to do this. It's common sense. These people are not your allies. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways. Sorry, it's just common sense.
Hey guys, Asmongold's biggest fan Max here, and I've been loving two words in politics lately. Common sense. It's always been this sort of nebulous term which conservatives have loved alluding to, but right now in 2025, with God Emperor Trump back in the White House, its usage has exploded. It all started at his inaugural speech on the 20th of January this year, where he declared,
"With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense." It's all about common sense.
Well, okay, I'm not gonna lie, that does sound kinda exciting, so what was step one gonna be in this common sense revolution? Well, 10 days later, when 67 people were killed in a mid-air collision between a passenger plane and military helicopter, Trump was ready to put his plan into action. At a press conference addressing the incident with absolutely zero evidence to support him, Trump decided to blame the crash on DEI policies, as apparently there were pilots being hired who had
severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing.
Amazing!
That's right. Even though the investigation had barely begun, Trump's galaxy brain and infinite wisdom had already determined the true cause. Now, when a reporter asked him how he possibly could have come to that conclusion not even 24 hours after the crash, Trump simply responded,
"Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't."
Wow. And they said the revolution wasn't going to be televised. But okay, that press conference was 6 months ago, and a lot more details about the crash have been released since then. We now know the helicopter had a malfunctioning altimeter, there was a communication breakdown between the pilots, and air control staff failed to deliver vital emergency instructions. These were all contributing factors, and although we still have to wait until early next year to get the full report, do you want to know which claim still has zero credible evidence to support it? Yeah, that whole DEI thing Trump said. As it turns out, using your common sense to decipher deeply complex situations like, oh, I don't know, mid-air collisions between aircraft isn't a particularly effective way of arriving at the truth. Yet for some strange reason, common sense has become this absolute rallying cry for the MAGA movement, and in my estimation, it's having a pretty corrosive effect on political discourse. Like, if you want to see the impact of it in real time, look no further than the most popular political streamer in the world right now, and our good friend who happened to feature in the intro to this video, Asmongold. It honestly baffles me that one of the most influential voices in online politics right now is a gamer who spends 6 hours a day vomiting out common sense drivel based on cherry-picked Twitter clips and submissions to his own fucking subreddit. We are so unbelievably fucked if that is the scope of our political engagement, but we won't start the Asmongold hate posting just yet. So, fellow truth seekers, come join me on a journey to understand the extremely ideological, dogmatic, and ultimately flawed way of thinking which is holding conservative brains captive. So okay, before we can dive into any of the fun stuff, I think it's first important that we understand what is actually meant by the term common sense. As I alluded to in the intro, it's a pretty nebulous phrase which means different things to different people, and that can make pinpointing an exact definition a little challenging. But with that being said, I think Duncan Watts, a social scientist who has written extensively on this topic, offers us a pretty good starting point. Roughly speaking, common sense is the loosely organized set of facts, observations, experiences, insights, and pieces of received wisdom that each of us accumulates over a lifetime in the course of encountering, dealing with, and learning from everyday situations. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the most important place to start is the fact that common sense is very intuitive and practical by nature. For example, we'd say it's common sense to let everyone out of an elevator before you get in one, it's common sense to look both ways before you cross the road, and it's common sense to say please and thank you when somebody does something for you. These are all things the average person picks up in their day-to-day life as they observe other people in society complying with these norms. And once you get that type of practical wisdom, it just becomes a subconscious response in the future. You know, once you burn your hand on a hot stove, you hopefully don't have to think too hard about doing it again. And look, in your day-to-day life, I'm not going to sit here and argue that that isn't a valuable thing to have. There's good reason as to why we associate so many positive connotations with this type of common sense, as the people who have it tend to be sensible, they make good decisions, and they lead stable lives. You know, I don't think we'd have a functioning society if everybody acted like that one friend who doesn't see a problem with going on 2 a.m. alcohol-fueled side quests with the handful of strangers they just met at a bar. So when we're dealing with our interpersonal lives, common sense is unquestionably a very valuable thing to have, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find literally anybody who disagrees with that. So okay, if it can be such a good thing, then why am I clowning on our good friend Asmongold and his common sense Israel-Palestine takes? Well, if we loop back to that initial definition for a moment, you'll notice two key words at the end there. Everyday situations. Yes, when we're waiting in line at the shops, taking the bus to work, or eating at a restaurant, we should rely on our common sense to govern our behavior. However, the second we start to scale up those intuitions from one-on-one interactions to, I don't know, government policy aimed at resolving complex issues on a societal level, well, we're gonna run into some pretty significant issues. To get an idea of what I'm talking about here, I want to show you this fantastic clip I found between common sense warrior, man of the people Piers Morgan, and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. They were having a discussion about the creation of the universe, and in trying to wrap his head around the Big Bang, Piers asked this.
Well, someone as logical as you are, and I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
And hey, that seems like a fair enough question. As someone who also doesn't know jack shit about astrophysics or the creation of the universe, the idea of something coming from nothing feels rather unintuitive. So, let's see what Richard Dawkins has to say in response.
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say first of all. They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
Oh my god, did you hear that? Richard Dawkins is suggesting that maybe our intuitions are a little misguided when it comes to something as deeply complex as the creation of the universe itself. Who could have possibly guessed that? Also, as a bit of context, Dawkins does sound a little passive-aggressive here, but that's only because Piers had been interrupting him moments before.
But whatever it was, it
But it
got to be
has to,
simple.
doesn't it?
You
Just on
cannot
that?
suddenly invoke...
Doesn't it have to?
Anyway, now that Dawkins has highlighted the inaccessibility of this topic for mere laymen, let's see what illuminating response Piers conjures up next.
Well, it makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. I think you're a logical man. That cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when every part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical.
It makes no sense, does it? Wow, thank you, common sense champion Piers Morgan, for making his exact fucking point. Unsurprisingly, the realm of theoretical astrophysics doesn't lend itself to neat little common sense explanations, especially on debate shows where the host is actively seeking confrontation to maximize entertainment value. I think the most telling part about this conversation is the fact that Dawkins preempts it entirely with his initial response.
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist.
He knows to stay in his own lane from the get-go, and you can see how visibly frustrated he gets as Piers continues to try and poke and prod for an easy explanation which simply doesn't exist. Now obviously, this is more of a scientific example rather than a political one, but I think the general premise still rings true. To put it simply, our intuitions are not to be trusted in the task of deciphering complexity. Now, you may argue that something like theoretical astrophysics is much more abstract than politics and has a higher bar to entry, but this could not be further from the truth. When we enter the realm of the social sciences with disciplines like economics, sociology, and politics, we are studying the way in which millions and millions of people interact with one another inside of these massive systems. That introduces a world of complexity which our little peanut brains and its primal intuitions can't even begin to comprehend without a lot of care and nuance. For example, let's take a topic like managing the consequences of climate change. At the heart of this issue is a balancing act between the need to protect and preserve our natural environment with the need to grow the economy. There's a clear tension between those two things, which are both very important when it comes to ensuring the prosperity of a nation, and some type of balance needs to be struck between them. So what does that look like in terms of policy? Do you try a carbon tax to make polluting more costly? What effect does that have on inflation for everyday consumers? Might that reduce consumption and therefore stall economic development? Should you give tax credits to businesses which use renewable sources of energies? What about investing more into the research and development of future technologies? Additionally, you also have to consider the international element there is to climate change as well. It's a global problem which requires every nation to pull their weight, but this introduces a free rider problem to the mix. One country may set ambitious targets to reduce the CO2 they emit, whilst another may double down on their emissions to grow their economy more rapidly. That's the exact reason Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017, as, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, he felt as though other nations were taking advantage of the United States and their efforts to reduce emissions. I mean, fuck, just look at this 2012 banger from the Don on Twitter. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. And look, that's barely even scratching the surface when it comes to climate change and its implications, and can you see how much you have to know just to start to even understand the complexity at play here? There are so many different disciplines intersecting when it comes to these issues, with their own respective experts and academics who've spent their entire lives educating themselves, and personally, I don't think your baseline level intuitions hold a candle to that level of complexity. You know, when one nation, a far-right party here in Australia, has a page on their website labeled Net Zero Common Sense, it kind of has me scratching my head because I don't really understand which part of anything we just talked about could be properly understood through the lens of common sense. That type of language is massively reductive and dismisses any level of nuance which political issues like climate change absolutely demand. Alright, I hope everyone enjoyed that entree of climate change because it's now time to get to the mouth-watering main course of immigration. This is one of the most polarizing issues in global politics today, and it's a place where we see a lot of painful fucking discourse. To get an idea of what I'm talking about, let's run through some of the common sense talking points you'll hear from a conservative. Illegal immigrants are stealing jobs from native-born workers, they reduce the wages of working class people as they're willing to work for less money, and they drive up house prices because they need somewhere to stay. I think that's a fair representation, and I loosely based it off something Trump said at his State of the Union address all the way back in 2019.
Meanwhile, working class Americans are left to pay the price for mass illegal immigration. Reduced jobs, lower wages, overburdened schools, hospitals that are so crowded you can't get in, increased crime, and a depleted social safety net.
And this also happens to be something our good friend Asmongold has talked about on his stream too.
And you're also taking those jobs away from citizens that are here. And also, yeah, good point. Where do they live? Well, they live in houses. Well, okay, well, we have people that don't have houses that are in the country now. Well, what the fuck? Like, I mean, it's just, this is not even a question.
And look, I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of conservatives agree with some form of this logic that we've seen from both Trump and Asmongold. There is a limited pool of resources, whether it be jobs, government welfare, or housing, and illegal immigrants / mass migration puts a strain on those resources, which negatively affects everybody in the country. On its surface, this feels like it could be a plausible common sense take, but unfortunately, these claims are either 1, outright incorrect, or 2, so misleading to a point which is downright deceitful. So, to get a better idea of the complexity which underpins an issue like immigration, let's take a deeper look point by point. We'll start with the jobs argument first. Conservatives are 50% correct when they say immigrants are taking jobs from native-born workers, but they're ignoring the other half of that equation. Now, hopefully this isn't too much of a shock, but it actually turns out that migrants have to sustain their own existence in the exact same way that a native-born citizen does. That means buying food for their families, paying rent to live somewhere, and purchasing a whole host of goods and services, which brings an additional level of consumption to the economy, which wouldn't otherwise exist. As a result, businesses have to start producing more stuff, which uses extra economic activity, and would you look at that, we're creating new job opportunities. This is something economists have known for a while, and this misconception even has a name: the lump of labor fallacy. It's wrong to think of an economy as a fixed pie in which there's a finite amount of work to be done and you're fighting with other people to get your share. No, they're much more fluid than that, and the amount of work to be done scales with the level of economic activity and production. For example, when women began entering the workforce in the 1960s, there was a big fear that they'd be taking jobs away from men. I mean, think about it. If you're about to have millions of people flood the labor force, surely that has to come at the expense of male employment, right? Well, no, actually. More people working meant more people earning money and consuming, which meant the economy began growing, which meant more jobs were being created. Just take a look at the rates of employment for men and women aged between 25 and 54 over the last 60 years. Now sure, there has been a slight decrease in male employment over time from 92% to 86%, but as economist Paul Krugman notes, this is due to a decline in manufacturing and other industries which have been lost thanks to globalization. And this is the same thing we view when it comes to immigration, and it's proven by study after study after study. I mean, hell, if you look at the US specifically, immigrants are 80% more likely to start a business compared to their native counterparts, leading to higher levels of overall employment than there otherwise would be, which is supported by some of the latest research too. Now, if you want to go into the gritty details, you could argue that immigration does displace workers in the immediate short term, but that's not the type of nuance people are wanting to work with when they're chanting, immigrants are stealing our jobs. So yeah, this is the first common sense take, which doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, wages are a slightly more complicated story. If we're using the basic economic theory of supply and demand, then we'd expect to see wages to fall when there's an influx of new labor in the economy thanks to migration, but this isn't really reflected in the empirical evidence. If we take a look at this meta-analysis from 2024, which pulls together 42 different studies, they conclude that immigration's effect on wages is close to zero and often not statistically significant. This older meta-analysis from 2010 found something similar, with the wage and employment effects of an immigration shock being very small. Or here, a study from the Reserve Bank of Australia in 2019 found that we typically do not see large effects of immigration on wages, and the effects these studies do find are often positive. And again, one final meta-analysis from 2014 concluded that most estimates are small and, on average, essentially zero. Now, this is obviously a little reductive to the nuances here, as immigration and its effect on the economy is extremely context dependent. For example, that RBA study I mentioned earlier found that immigration was actually helping to reduce inequality here in Australia. Because our immigration policy favors high-skilled labor, that increases the level of competition around high-skilled job openings, which was found to slightly reduce those wages whilst disproportionately increasing the wages of low-skilled workers. Therefore, in an Australian context, we actually found that immigration had a positive effect on the wages of working-class people. Now, to be clear, that seemed to be more of an isolated example from what I was able to read, so let's hone in on the general consensus here. At worst, immigration has a slightly deflationary effect on the wages of working class people, but this is massively outweighed by the benefits it provides to the economy more generally. And hey, as someone who actually cares about the material conditions of the working class, that's an important caveat. In fact, I'd say that's a great political discussion to be had, as we should redistribute the economic gains of immigration such that everyone is better off in society, but do you really think that's the level of nuance you're going to get from a political commentator like Asmongold? My common sense says no. So yes, whilst immigration can cause a negligible decrease in the wages of working class people, though not always and can sometimes actually increase them, this downside is massively overblown by critics and fails to consider the enormous benefit which immigrants provide to the economy more generally. Now, thirdly and finally, I want to touch on the claim Asmongold made about housing, as no, immigrants are definitely not the issue here. This is probably the misconception which annoys me the most as an Australian, because we are experiencing the literal worst housing crisis in the world right now, and people love to use immigration as an easy scapegoat. I actually made a video on this topic earlier in the year, but the idea that migrants are to blame for housing unaffordability is a complete red herring which ignores the true structural issues at play. Here in Australia, current planning restrictions prevent medium and high density dwellings from being built. There's a criminal lack of public housing. We have awful tax incentives in place which make real estate a stupidly profitable investment, and there's a shortage of labor and supplies to actually build houses in the first place. These are the predominant issues at the heart of the housing crisis, not immigration. In fact, when 49 leading economists were asked to pick their preferred solution, only 6% of them said to restrain immigration, the third lowest response overall. Now, of course, more people coming into a country is going to increase the level of demand for housing, and nobody is denying that. However, to treat that as the foremost factor in housing unaffordability is delusional, as you could literally halt all immigration tomorrow, and guess what? We'd still have a housing crisis because of those other structural issues we mentioned earlier. Now, obviously, I'm talking about an Australian context here, but a lot of these points ring true for an American one as well. There is consensus amongst US economists that immigration is not one of the major factors driving house prices, and in fact, because so many migrants who move to the country are construction workers, they're probably having an outsized effect on the supply of housing rather than the demand. And, just like Australia, restrictive zoning laws and high construction costs have resulted in a housing shortage, and soaring mortgage rates have made things completely unaffordable. So when a Republican senator like Carrie Lake says, it's just basic common sense, these people have to live somewhere, and this is basic supply and demand, they are being deliberately obtuse to the actual issues at play here. I mean, come on, look no further than the early stages of COVID back in 2020. Even when international travel was non-existent, property prices in most developed nations absolutely skyrocketed, despite the flow of migrants halting entirely. So although immigration is certainly a demand-side factor when it comes to house prices and rent, it's often used as a red herring to distract you from the true structural causes which are actually to blame for housing unaffordability. So would you look at that? When we break down the common sense arguments against immigration, they turn out to be either 1, categorically incorrect, or 2, intentionally misleading or massively overblown. Now, the funny thing is, after everything I just said, I wouldn't blame you for thinking I'm some globalist, pro-mass immigration, lefty loony, but that simply isn't the case. There's obviously going to be a level of immigration which is detrimental to both the person who wants to move to a country and the native citizens who are already there. And I don't want that. But that's not really my main point here. Just like that one really annoying math teacher you had in 7th grade who insisted that you showed you're working when you solve an equation, I'm concerned with the process people are using to arrive at their political convictions, or more accurately, the lack thereof. When your understanding of the world is merely a pastiche of Twitter hot takes and Reddit clips woven together with your deeply flawed intuitions, well, that's how you end up going off the deep end, ranting that Palestinians deserve to be genocide. And on that note, actually, the scariest thing about a political commentator like Asmongold is that he doesn't seem to care that this is his process of arriving at the truth. When someone in his chat directly challenged him over the fact that he doesn't seem to do any research to arrive at his political beliefs, this is how he responded.
No, you think and feel a lot. I've never seen you actually do some research. Why would I need to do research? I already know it. Yeah, I just come to conclusions. And then they're right. Pretty much every single time.
At first, I thought he was joking here and actually laughed because, based alert, who the fuck needs to do research when you're always right? But then he continues.
Like, if it's such a bad idea to do that, then why do I keep coming out with positive outcomes? You really think that all these people coming from countries that have totally different laws and the ways that they treat women over there, you really think that there's not going to be an increase in bad behavior in that area? Especially when there's no vetting properly to make sure the ones that are acting in good faith or not? You don't need to have statistics for that. It's common sense. Like, I don't need to see 50 different studies to know if you put a wolf in a cage with 10 rabbits, there's not going to be 10 rabbits by the end of the day. I don't need to have like 50 fucking studies of this. I don't need to have a million levels of data and representation for it. It's common fucking a priori knowledge that every single reasonable person knows. Sorry. It's just the way it is.
Oh my god, he wasn't fucking joking. This is the most influential political streamer in the world, and this is unironically what he thinks about academia. The situation he just described of how cultures can potentially clash when people immigrate is quite literally the purpose of studies and why they're so useful. Like, seriously, conducting a natural experiment around a population that experiences an increase of immigrants and analyzing the consequences of that sounds like the single most useful thing you could have to have a more informed opinion on this topic. I know that's a little different to watching one video of an anti-immigration protest in the UK and basing your worldview on that, but unfortunately, a study like this would be a much more accurate representation of reality. Dismissing the possibility that a study could be useful here by going, oh, actually, if you put a wolf in the cage, it's gonna eat a rabbit, it's gonna eat a rabbit. And then using your common sense is like actually so insane, I'm kinda at a loss for words. I mean, come on, just look at where his common fucking a priori knowledge got him last time when we were talking about the economics of immigration. He was comically uninformed on its effect on housing and outright wrong when he said that immigrants are stealing jobs. Like, holy shit, if your intuitions are leading you to these blatantly false conclusions and you're embracing anti-intellectualism, why the fuck should your political opinion hold literally any weight? These issues demand so much more care and nuance than he's giving them, and I will never be able to comprehend how this guy is actually the most influential political streamer in the world today. With almost all my Asmongold hate posting out the way, there's one final point I'd like to discuss when it comes to common sense politics, and it's actually the one which inspired this video in the first place. It's all to do with context. And to understand what I'm getting at, just consider this for a moment. Back in 1988 in the United States, it's estimated that support for same-sex marriage was just 11%, which means the overwhelming majority of people did not want that right extended to homosexual couples. Yet, if we fast forward 37 years to 2025, things have completely flipped on their head, with support now sitting at 68% in the United States. We will ignore the fact that Republican support has declined from a peak of 55% in 2022 to 41% in 2025, because that's besides the point here. And I mean, hell, why stop at 1988? Back in 1779, Thomas Jefferson tried to reduce the maximum punishment for sodomy from death to just castration, but it was rejected by the Virginia legislature. Now, if people were literally willing to kill others for having gay sex, what does that say about the common sense take on homosexuality in the 18th century? In fact, I can almost guarantee you that there was some Asmongold equivalent back then writing op-eds in the Boston Times about how sodomy is an unnatural perversion of the sexual act, and anyone with common sense would know that since the writings of Thomas Aquinas in the late 13th century. And there's also another example I want to look at. In the first chapter of Ha-Joon Chang's book, The 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, he raises an interesting point about the evolving definition of the free market through time. He uses the example of the Cotton Factories Regulation Act of 1819 in Britain, where the government sought to ban the employment of young children under the age of 9 due to how dangerous the working conditions were for them. And, as insane as it may sound to us today, this stirred up a massive controversy at the time, as critics thought it undermined the very idea of a free market. Because we're 2 centuries removed from that situation, I think we'd all agree that the use of child labor is a moral abomination, but for someone living through the Industrial Revolution, well, if a child voluntarily enters the agreement, and they want the money and are willing to do the work, who are you to tell them that they can't? Just like the treatment of queer people throughout history, this just highlights how our sensibilities are bound by the time and context we exist in, and that's really important to remember. Fuck, I just realized that kind of sounds like a Kamala Harris quote, and I'm sorry that it does.
You exist in the context
of all in which you live and what came before you.
By definition, our common sense is anchored to the present moment. It's informed by whatever the current societal and cultural norms are, and this tends to make people's intuitions a passive endorsement of the status quo as a byproduct. Although this can be problematic when it comes to something like the treatment of gay people before the year like 2010, it also does have the power for good. As long as they don't grow up in one of those freakish Republican households which are actively regressing, they're not gonna have to think twice about the issue of same-sex marriage. They'll learn it's a right which is constitutionally protected, they'll see queer characters in the media they consume, and they'll undoubtedly have friends and family who openly express their sexuality too. The world they're growing up in has, maybe not completely, but greatly normalized the existence of queer people, and that is going to inform their intuitions on the matter. It just makes you think, how are future generations going to reflect on our common sense views of the present day? Like, in the same way we condemn our forefathers for shit like slavery and colonialism, I just wonder what we're normalizing in society right now, which my great-great-great-great-great-grandson is gonna look back and criticize us for. Perhaps the developed world's inaction on global poverty, how long it's taken us to get our shit together on climate change, or, my personal bet, I think it'll be the absolute atrocity that is factory farming, but we won't talk about that for the 3rd video in a row. To put ourselves into the shoes of future generations, or to step back at least with some degree of impartiality, which acknowledges our place in history, only gives us more clarity in the way we approach today's issues. In fact, this line of thinking kinda reminds me of this one banger quote that there is from MLK. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Given the trajectory of human history and how we've tended to improve things over time, with a few hiccups along the way, it would seem safe to assume that a handful of our common sense attitudes of today are flawed in ways we can't even conceptualize yet. Obviously, it's impossible to predict the future and know what we're wrong about, but I think that's exactly why we should bring some skepticism and open-mindedness to the societal norms we embrace today. To think we have everything figured out at this exact point in history when the light bulb was only made like 146 years ago feels a little bit optimistic to me. Ultimately, today's common sense was yesterday's revolution, and to think we don't have some more revolutions coming up in the future, whether they be philosophical, technological, or just outright violent conflict, would be a little bit naive, to say the very least. So, where does that all leave us? Well, the first thing I want to clarify after everything I've said here is, no, I'm not endorsing a technocracy here. If you don't know, a technocracy is basically a system of government where society is run by a handful of technical experts, and no, fuck that, I love me some representative democracy. Although I am obviously critical of people who take a common sense approach to politics, I don't mean to suggest that the discussion of these issues should be restricted to just academics and technical experts. I think it should be everyone's democratic responsibility to discuss these contentious topics, but when we do so, there just needs to be a higher level of critical engagement. To quote an article written by Barbara Leckie, common sense is the comfort food of thinking, And if you want to arrive at some version of the truth, then you gotta put the work in. Keep an open mind, challenge your own viewpoints, read a book or two on a topic you find interesting, skim over some studies, and then partake in a bit of intellectual sparring. Like, I just find it so utterly horrifying that there's a large portion of people whose only engagement with the realm of politics is watching fucking Asmongold clips on YouTube. At that point, you're basically just one of those prisoners Plato wrote about in the allegory of the cave, watching shadows flicker on a wall, believing that to be the true nature of reality. To wrap up my hate posting on Asmongold here, I initially planned to make a joke about whether or not he's even read a book in his life before, but it turns out he already answered that question when reacting to a video on stream back in July.
I don't read books. I don't.
They're a waste of time.
He went on to justify this by saying that he actually does read for hours a day, but I'm not sure if r/Asmongold and your Twitter timeline count in the same way that reading a book does. Anyway, I'm sure there are some common sense assumptions baked into my worldview, which are misguided and incorrect, but that's why I always try to keep an open mind, sometimes to a fault. We've all got blind spots, try to be aware of them, do your research, and just have a solid foundation for your own political beliefs and convictions. Anyway though, I think that's everything I have to say about common sense. I did want to go on a rant about Umberto Eco and anti-intellectualism being a slippery slope down to fascist thinking, but this video is long enough, so I think we'll have to save that for another time. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. I'd be really interested to see what people think about this video, so make sure you drop a comment below. If you did enjoy, make sure to check out my Discord, check out the Instagram and Twitter. And with that out the way, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.